My father disowned my sister, and he is now facing the end of his life. How might I encourage her to let him go? It was a typical Saturday in 2003. The house was quiet, except for the occasional laughter from the TV in the living room, where my father was going through some old mail that had piled up. We were unaware that this pile held a significant issue that was about to affect our family. My father was the kind of person who liked to keep things organized. On that particular Saturday, my father was attempting to clear out the accumulated junk mail and old bills that had piled up over the past few weeks. However, he came across something rather unexpected. It was an envelope that did not appear to be a bill or a simple letter from a friend. Instead, it contained a series of romantic messages and hotel receipts. These items seemed to suggest that my mother was having an affair. However, it was not just any affair. It was with John, her childhood best friend, John. My father and John had been inseparable since their days in grade school, sharing everything from baseball cards to the biggest moments in life. John was not just a friend to my father. He was like a brother to him. He had never been the best man at my parents' wedding, standing proudly by Dad's side as he vowed to love Mom for better or worse. In a way, those vows now seemed to be coming true. When Dad first saw those receipts and love notes, he sat there in disbelief. His hands trembled as he tried to piece together the timeline, the secret meetings, and the betrayal from the two people he trusted most. It felt like a slap in the face and a betrayal that reached. It was a painful experience that tore at the very core of his being. I was at home that day working on a school project in my room. I was unaware of the turmoil unfolding downstairs. It wasn't until I heard a loud thud that I went down to investigate. There was my father, sitting on the floor with receipts and letters scattered around him. His face reflected a profound anguish. "What's wrong, Dad?" I asked, kneeling beside him and trying to make sense of the scattered papers. He didn't respond at first, just shaking his head. His head as if trying to wake up from a bad dream, but it wasn't a dream. With a shaky voice, he managed to put words to his pain. "It's your mom and John. They've been seeing each other." He handed me a hotel receipt dated just last week. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavily between us. I didn't know what to say or do. My mind raced with images of Mom and JN. The times they had been their interactions seemed a bit too friendly, and their laughter was a bit too loud. It all made a twisted sense now. Dad spent the next hour explaining everything he had found, with each detail. His voice grew more resigned. He had always been the strong one, the problem solver, the foundation of our family. Seeing him like this, broken and defeated, was something I had never prepared for. The days that followed were a blur of hushed phone calls and closed-door conversations. Dad confronted Mom, who at first denied everything but the evidence. It was difficult to ignore the evidence. She finally admitted to the affair. Her words were hollow, her excuses flimsy. She said she had fallen out of love, and John was there. Her voice was void of the warmth it once had. She said she was sorry he had to find out this way. She was sorry, and the word echoed through the house, mocking the years of love and sacrifice Dad had poured into our family. He begged her to reconsider, to go to counseling, to try to mend what had been broken. But it was too late. She had made up her mind. It is important to note that she was leaving him for JN. The news spread like wildfire, and each of us kids reacted in our own way. We felt a range of emotions, including disbelief, anger, and sadness. These feelings combined to create a tumultuous situation that threatened to further divide our family. Of all of us, Sarah, my sister, was the one who took it the hardest. She had always been the apple of Dad's eye, the one who could do no wrong. However, in the weeks that followed, we noticed a change in her demeanor. She grew distant, her visits home less frequent, and her conversations with Dad strained and awkward. It seemed as though she was blaming him for not being enough for her or for keeping her mother happy. However, I knew it was more complicated than that. It was about her loyalties being tested and her life being uprooted. Mom and John moved in together not long after the divorce papers were filed. It was quick and almost ruthlessly so. They settled in a fancy part of town, and it seemed like Mom had a whole new life that didn't include us unless it was convenient. On the other hand, Dad tried to keep things as normal as possible for us. As normal as possible for us, but the strain was evident. He lost weight, his smiles became rarer, and the light in his eyes dimmed. Looking back, I realized that day marked the end of many things. Trust, of family unity, and of the innocence that once colored our daily lives. Dad's discovery wasn't just about infidelity. It was the unraveling of the tapestry of our family, thread by thread, until we were just individuals struggling to understand how the warmth and love we once shared had turned into cold, hard betrayal. The shared bond of family turned into a painful betrayal as I observed my father trying to rebuild his life. His spirit was still there, but it was hurting. I learned about the resilience of the human heart, but the scars remained a constant reminder of the day our family changed forever. After the storm that was my mother's departure, the house felt different, emptier somehow, even with all of us still living there. My father did his best to keep things normal, but you could tell he was just going through the motions. It seemed like his heart wasn't in it anymore. It's understandable that he would feel this way. His best friend and wife had turned his life upside down in the middle of all this chaos. Sarah, my twin sister, had always been Dad's little girl. One would think she'd stick by him through something like this, but things didn't turn out that way. Instead, Sarah became more and more withdrawn from Dad. As time went by, she became closer to Mom and, by extension, to John. It was as if she were switching sides in slow motion. Sarah's decision to stay with Mom after it was a surprise to all of us when she moved out. She was 27 and had the right to make her own decisions, but it felt like a betrayal on top of a betrayal. Dad tried to hide his disappointment, but there was a hurt in his eyes that was hard to miss. He'd lost his wife, and now it felt like he was losing his daughter too. The whole dynamic in our family shifted. Weekends, which used to be loud and full of life, became tense and awkward. Sarah would come. It became evident that she was merely going through the motions. Conversations were awkward, punctuated by long silences where there used to be laughter. It was as if she was a guest in her own home, uncertain of her place or what to say. Matters became even more complex when Sarah announced her intention to change her career path. From the earliest days, she had aspired to become a doctor, following in her father's footsteps. He was a surgeon, and she had often expressed her desire to follow in his footsteps. It was a surprise to everyone when she suddenly started talking about going to law school instead. It didn't take a genius to figure out that Mom and JN were behind this. They were both lawyers, and it seemed they had their own plans for her. Dad was very sad. It was one thing to lose his wife to his best friend, but losing his daughter's aspirations too was a different kind of pain. He tried to talk to her about it and try to understand her decision, but Sarah was very firm that it was something she needed to do for herself. She would say, "myself," but her words felt somewhat lacking in substance. It was evident that this was not merely a personal decision for her. John became a regular figure in her life, offering guidance, assistance with her law school applications, and even an opportunity to join his firm upon graduation. It appeared as though he was preparing her to assume his role, gradually transforming her into a person who was less reminiscent of her father. The transformation in Sarah was difficult to witness. She began to resemble her mother more, ambitious and determined, yet also somewhat detached and analytical. The warmth that had once defined her seemed to. Dad tried to reach out to her, but it was never easy. Despite his reservations, he supported her decision to go to law school. He was proud of her, even though she'd be joining a firm rather than a prestigious hospital. The divide between them grew deeper with every passing year. Holidays were especially hard. Sarah would show up, but she was always in a hurry to leave to get back. To her new life with Mom and John, it felt like we were just checkboxes on her list of obligations, not her family. It wasn't just Dad who felt the shift. The rest of us did too. We tried to understand and be supportive, but it was tough. We missed our sister, the one who used to sneak out with us to go to movies and who'd spend hours talking about everything and nothing. Sarah was gone, and in her place was someone we barely recognized. It wasn't just the personal changes. It was a painful realization that our sister had chosen to prioritize the people who had caused her pain over those who had always been there for her. Every forced conversation and every visit served as a reminder of what we had lost. As our father's health began to decline, I observed him grappling with the image of the daughter he had raised and the woman Sarah had become. He still loved her, but his feelings seemed to have changed. It was evident that his love had become somewhat resigned, and there was a hint of sadness in it that spoke of irrevocable changes. In hindsight, those years represented a gradual unraveling of the close-knit family we once were. We were all grappling with the fallout in our own ways, but for Dad, the betrayal was a double-edged sword, cutting deep and leaving wounds that seemed to take an inordinate amount of time to heal. Sarah's shift in allegiance didn't just change her relationship with Dad. It also altered her relationships with we all found ourselves in the position of bystanders to our own transformation, bearing witness to a shift that none of us had wanted but that we were all forced to accept. It was a painful realization, but one that taught us that sometimes, despite our best efforts, we have to let go and accept the new normal. We each adjusted to this new reality in our own way, clinging to the hope that things could one day be mended. However, as time passed, this hope gradually faded, overshadowed by the reality of our family was experiencing some challenges in 2017. We were hoping for a fresh start. Sarah was planning to get married, and despite some tensions, there was a sense of excitement around the event. Dad was always optimistic and wanted to make the best of it. He had always looked forward to seeing Sarah in a wedding dress and walking her down the aisle. He was excited for her to start a new life together. It was supposed to be a happy moment, a bright spot in our lives. After the dissolution of our family, Sarah was aware of the significance this event held for her father. When he wrote her a check for the wedding, it was not merely a financial contribution. It was a gesture that demonstrated his continued support and commitment, regardless of circumstances. He often discussed weddings, whether on television or when attending them as guests. When it was Sarah's turn, he would say, "It's going to be perfect." The planning process spanned several months. Despite the strained relationship between Sarah and her father, he was involved every step of the way. He never let his personal feelings toward her mother and John interfere with his efforts to be there for Sarah. He attended every tasting and every dress fitting, always enthusiastic and supportive. However, just one day before the wedding, everything came crashing down. Sarah dropped the news casually, almost too casually, during what we thought was a final routine check-in. She said, "Oh, by the way, I decided that JN and Dad are both going to walk me down the aisle." Through her planner, not even looking up, the room went still. You could almost hear the collective heart drop. Dad's face. I will never forget it. It was as if someone had punched him right in the gut. The hurt was palpable, etched deep in his expression. Both of us. Why his voice was calm, but you could hear the tremor of suppressed emotion. Sarah finally looked up, her eyes flicking between Dad and me as if she was weighing how much to reveal. "Well, John's been a big part of my life too. It's also a part of my life. You know, it just feels right to have you both there." Dad was trying to understand her point of view, but it was clear he was struggling. "Sarah," I always thought his voice trailed off at the end of the sentence. The dream was unfulfilled, and the argument that followed was unlike any we had witnessed before in our family. Dad usually tried to avoid confrontation at all costs, but he couldn't hold back his pain and disappointment. It all came pouring out in a torrent of words. That seemed unusual coming from him. "You want him there after everything, after what they did." Dad's voice rose, a rare occurrence that marked the gravity of his feelings. Sarah was defensive, her words sharp and cutting. "He's my family too, Dad. He's been there for me in ways you just haven't been lately." That stung. Watching Dad's face crumple at her words was almost too much to bear. The fight escalated, voices raised, harsh words thrown like daggers, slicing. Despite the strong familial bonds, in the end, Dad was unable to attend the wedding. The thought of standing next to John, the man who played a role in the breakdown of his marriage and family, and smiling for the cameras was too much for him. "If that's your decision, Sarah, then I can't be a part of this," he said. Sarah tried to persuade him otherwise, thinking perhaps he would change his mind, but Dad was firm in his decision. He didn't attend the wedding, instead staying home alone to process his emotions. Silence and solitude while Sarah walked down the aisle with John by her side. The fallout from that decision was significant. Our family was already experiencing challenges, and this decision further strained our relationships. Dad and Sarah's relationship, which had been a cornerstone of his happiness, underwent a significant shift. Many in the family sided with Dad, viewing Sarah's decision as a betrayal not just of her father but of the values we had previously shared. After the wedding, Sarah reached out several times in an effort to repair the damage. Dad was no longer willing to forgive. The wedding photos, which should have been a source of joy, became a symbol of what was lost. They showed a beaming Sarah, beautiful in her dress, but beside her instead of Dad was John, smiling broadly as if he hadn't a care in the world. The years that followed were challenging. Sarah's attempts at reconciliation were met with a lack of warmth from Dad. She was either absent or, if present, treated with a certain distance. Dad's politeness was often perceived as indifference, even as his health began to decline. The wounds of the wedding day remained unresolved and painful. The man who had once been the life of every party and the heart of our family seemed to retreat into a shell of his former self. His joy seemed dimmed by the shadows of past hurts. As I watched all this unfold, I wondered if there would ever be a way back for Sarah and Dad, or if some choices once made left scars too deep to ever. Dad's health started to decline rapidly earlier this year, which unfortunately made it increasingly difficult to reconcile with Sarah. The man who had once been larger than life, always the first to crack a joke or offer a comforting word, was now a shadow of his former self. Pancreatic cancer is a challenging illness, and it was difficult to see Dad struggling through treatment after treatment with no real hope of recovery. It was undoubtedly one of the most challenging experiences our family has ever faced. Sarah's efforts to reconnect seemed somewhat desperate and, to some of us, a bit insincere. That may have been unfair. She likely had regrets, and her reaching out may have been genuine. But to Dad, it was too little, too late. The hurt from the wedding, from her choosing John over him, had cut too deep. He had closed that chapter of his life, and no amount of pleading or apologies from Sarah could open it again. "Why now?" Dad would mutter whenever her name came up. "I think he's just feeling guilty. It's not about me. It's about her trying to clear her conscience." Maybe he was right, or maybe it was his way of coping with the pain. Either way, he was adamant about not seeing her, not even when she offered to come over to try to make amends and be part of his life again. The tension this created within our family was palpable. Some relatives thought Dad should forgive her and not let these final days be shadowed by the past. They would argue that, as her biological parent, he should forgive her and allow her back into his life, despite the pain and betrayal she had caused. However, he was determined and his decision was final. He did not want her around, and that was that. It is interesting to note how illness can affect a person. Dad, who had previously been very forgiving, had become more hardened and cynical. It was not just the cancer that was affecting him. There was also the bitterness and unresolved anger that we all felt. It was a heavy cloud hanging over the house, making those last few months even more strained. Sarah, for her part, didn't push too hard. Perhaps she finally understood the depth of Dad's feelings, or maybe she was protecting herself from further rejection. She sent cards and occasionally checked in with me or my other siblings to see how he was doing, but she never came to visit. Then, as Dad's days became numbered, the reality of losing him hit us all like a ton of bricks. I found myself torn, wanting to honor his wishes while also wishing for a different outcome. I found myself torn between honoring his wishes and wishing for a Hollywood-style reunion where everything was magically resolved. However, real life isn't like the movies. There are no endings, no perfect resolutions where everyone hugs and forgives just before the credits roll. I spent a lot of time with Dad during those last weeks, just sitting with him, sometimes talking, sometimes just watching old westerns on TV. He loved those in those quiet moments. I'd sometimes bring up Sarah, tentatively testing the waters, but he'd shake his head. He would kindly suggest that we simply enjoy the movie and let it go, recognizing that this was not a battle I could win. Earlier this year, Dad's health began to decline rapidly, and with it, Any hope of reconciling with Sarah also seemed to slip away. The man who had once been larger than life, always the first to crack a joke or offer a comforting word, was now a shadow of his former self. Pancreatic cancer is a formidable disease, and it was difficult to watch Dad struggle through treatment after treatment with no real hope of recovery. It was probably one of the hardest things our family has ever had to endure throughout this ordeal. Sarah's attempts to reconnect felt desperate and to some of us a bit insincere. That may have been unfair. She probably did have regrets, and maybe her reaching out was genuine, but to Dad it was too little, too late. The hurt from the wedding, from her choosing John over him, had cut too deep. He had closed that chapter of his life, and despite Sarah's pleas and apologies, he was unable to reopen it. Whenever her name came up, he would mutter, "She's just feeling guilty. That's all. It's not about me. It's about her. She's trying to clear her conscience." He was convinced that he was right, or perhaps he was simply trying to cope with the pain. Either way, he was adamant about not seeing her, not even when she offered to come over to try to make amends. It was evident that there was a great deal of tension within our family as a result of this situation. Some of our relatives felt that our father should forgive her, and that he should not allow the last few days of his life to be overshadowed by past conflicts. They would say that she was still his daughter and that the biological tie should override the years of hurt and betrayal. However, our father was determined, and his decision was final. He did not want her to be present, and that was that. It is interesting to note how illness can change a person. Our father, who had previously been very forgiving, had become more hardened and cynical. Sol had become more hardened and more cynical. It wasn't just the cancer eating away at his body. It was the bitterness and the unresolved anger we all felt. This made those last few months even more strained. Sarah, for her part, didn't push too hard. Maybe she finally understood the depth of Dad's feelings. Or maybe she was protecting herself from further rejection. She sent cards and called occasionally. She always checked in with me or my other siblings to see how he was. She never came to visit, not once. As Dad's days became numbered, we all began to realize the reality of losing him. I found myself torn between honoring his wishes and wishing for a Hollywood-style reunion where everything was magically resolved. However, real life isn't like the movies. There are no neat endings or perfect resolutions where everyone hugs and forgives just before the credits roll. I spent a lot of time with Dad during those last weeks. Sometimes I would sit with him and talk, and sometimes I would just watch old westerns on TV. He loved those in those quiet moments. I would sometimes bring up Sarah, tentatively testing the waters, but he would shake his head and shut down the conversation before it could really start. He would say, "Let's just enjoy the movie." And I would let it go, knowing this was not a battle I could win. I am very close to my dad, and the last few weeks are really difficult for me. Should I attempt to persuade her to let him go? I plan to update this post 1 week after I originally published it. My father's health declined rapidly, and we lost him exactly 1 month ago. It was a difficult process, and I had not anticipated the emotional impact. He endured a great deal in his final months, and while it was painful for us, he was ready to rest. He was lucid at the end, and he was tired. He expressed his gratitude to me and my older brothers. I found his words to me to be both poignant and moving. I won't go into detail about what he said, but I believe it's something best left between us. He also said goodbye to my daughters, aged 11 months and 2 years. He kissed them on the forehead and told them to be good girls. He told them he loved them, and it was a moment I will always remember. It is difficult for them to understand what has happened, and they still ask about Grandpa. When I try to explain that he is not coming back, they do not seem to understand. I am only 27 years old, and I can understand their confusion. I had planned to spend many more years with my dad, and it does not seem fair. The most difficult aspect of this situation was that my twin sister, Sarah, was not able to speak with her father before he passed away. I tried to initiate a conversation with him about Sarah, but he was not interested in discussing her. As time passed, Sarah became increasingly desperate, and then he died. While this outcome was anticipated, she was initially in a state of denial. His funeral was a beautiful ceremony, and many people shared their memories of him. It was a touching experience for Sarah, who had not seen her father since the night before her wedding. She was surprised to realize that he had lost a significant amount of weight. My father was always a bit overweight, so this was a stark change. Dad had lost a lot of weight due to cancer. She shed many tears throughout the funeral. My uncle and aunt tried to attend the ceremony, but they were asked to leave by my uncles. My father-in-law was a generous man who was able to provide for his family. He left behind a substantial inheritance for his children, including Sarah. He had set up a trust fund, which was a considerable sum of money for all his grandchildren, including Sarah's children, whom she had never had the opportunity to meet. It was a source of comfort to me that my father never placed a great deal of importance on money. He was simply keen for us to enjoy a comfortable lifestyle and to be assured that his grandchildren would have the financial support they needed in the future. The only difficulty arose in the form of a letter he had written to each of us, with the exception of Sarah. It was a very personal document, which included a great deal of information about my childhood. I found it very touching that he had taken the time to share these memories with me. I believe I must have read the letter like 100 times, and I shed tears each and every time. One of Dad's favorite pastimes was photography. He was quite an enthusiastic photographer, and the subjects of his photos were, for the most part, our family. However, after Mom passed away, it turned out to be just me and my siblings. As a result of this, we have a wealth of pictures from us growing up. He gave each of us a photo album, and, behind each photo, he wrote the location where it was taken and a few words. I was genuinely taken aback by the gesture. It's likely that he crafted this farewell gift long before his passing. It was a heartfelt and thoughtful gesture, a reflection of his character. Sarah, however, did not receive a letter, and her album did not include any images of roads behind her. When she discovered this, it understandably caused her distress. The regret was weighing heavily on her, and she was admitted to the hospital for an entire week. She's gradually improving, with each day bringing a little more stability. I am optimistic about her recovery. She is sleeping and eating almost normally now. She still cries randomly multiple times on a daily basis, but she is getting better. At least that is what I tell myself. Last week, my wife and I discovered that we are expecting again. It was not planned, and it is still very early in her pregnancy. I haven't told anyone yet. I'm feeling a range of emotions, including anger and sadness. I'm angry that my future child won't get to meet my dad. I'm also scared. My dad was supposed to guide me through the whole parenthood process. He taught me a lot with my daughters. I'm scared of doing this without him. I'm scared of not being a good father. I would like my children to have the same relationship with their father that I did. I believe they deserve that. This is the situation I'm in, and I'm trying to make the best of it. I think about what might have been, but that doesn't change anything. It's not easy to accept this outcome. I wish it could have been different. That's just how life is. It's not always fair. I'm grateful to everyone who offered advice and support during the chat. I was feeling isolated at the time. I'm grateful for your support. After my father passed away, my sister Sarah was struggling. She was carrying a lot of guilt about how things ended between her and my father. It was affecting her deeply. She was spending weeks crying, barely eating, and trying to figure out how to move forward. I was trying to be there for her as best as I could, but it wasn't easy. I was also dealing with my own grief and anger about how things had played out. I was unsure of how to respond to her emotional outburst, given the circumstances. Just when I thought we might be able to start healing, my mother made a surprising announcement. She called me unexpectedly and said she needed to talk. I could sense from her voice that something was troubling her, so I went to her house, hoping to understand what was going on. When I arrived, my mother was sitting at the kitchen table, looking distressed. She seemed upset and angry, as if the phone had offended her. She looked up at me with tired eyes and said, "John's been cheating on me." The room felt suddenly quiet. I didn't know what to say or how to react. This was the man she'd left her husband for, the man who had caused so much pain in our family, and now he was betraying her too. She told me how she found out. She'd noticed he was being more secretive lately. John was always careful to guard his phone and take calls in the other room. At first, she didn't want to believe it, She thought maybe she was just being paranoid. But then she saw the messages and texts from a younger woman. They were full of emojis and messages that made her feel uneasy. She confronted John, hoping he would deny it or even apologize and beg for forgiveness. Instead, he admitted to it like it was no big deal. He didn't seem sorry. He simply shrugged it off, stating that things just happen and that their relationship wasn't what it used to be. This response made it clear that he didn't seem to care much about anyone but himself. Mom was deeply upset and told him she wanted a divorce right then and there. JN didn't try to fight it or save their marriage. He simply agreed, as if relieved that she was the one making the decision. It seemed like it was over as quickly as it had started. I was surprised by the intensity of my emotions. On the one hand, I felt a strong sense of injustice at John's actions towards my mother. On the other hand, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction that he was finally facing the consequences of his actions. However, the real shock came when Sarah found out Sarah had been so close to John. She had practically chosen him over her father. And now this, when her mother told her, it was like watching someone's whole world crumble in front of you. Sarah completely broke down. She kept saying she couldn't believe she had defended him. She had pushed her father away for this man, who turned out to be just as bad as everyone had warned her. Sarah's guilt went into overdrive. She started replaying everything in her head. She thought about the way she had treated her father. She thought about the things she had said. She thought about the decisions she had made. And now all of it felt so meaningless, so stupid. She was angry, but more than that, she was heartbroken. The person she thought she could trust had betrayed her in the worst possible way, and it shattered her. She moved out of the house she and John had been living in and went to stay with a friend. She couldn't stand to be around him, and I could understand why. It seemed like every good memory she had with him was tainted, and every kind word he'd ever said. Meanwhile, my mother was dealing with her own challenges. The divorce was a difficult process for everyone involved. John tried to get as much as he could from the situation, despite being the one who had initiated the separation. There were disagreements about financial matters, property, and other issues. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion, knowing that there was little one could do to stop it. However, the most heartbreaking aspect was seeing how all of this was affecting Sarah. She was already struggling after the death of her father, and this only intensified her difficulties. She became increasingly isolated and silent. To almost everyone, she seemed to have withdrawn from the world. I tried to reach out and be there for her, but she wasn't receptive. She kept saying she needed time to figure things out on her own, which I respected. Sarah had always been the strong one, the one who knew what she wanted and went after it. But now she was lost, and I didn't know how to help her find her way back. She kept saying how much she regretted everything and how she wished she could go back and do it all differently. But we both knew that wasn't possible. Back and do it all differently, but we both knew that wasn't possible. As if all of this wasn't enough, the fallout from the divorce was ripping through the family. My mother was leaning on me more and more. Need.